Am I the only one that remembers that old Bloody Mary urban legend? Like, you have to say Bloody Mary 3 times in the mirror, and then you'll see her or something. Well, I've tried it multiple times, and it doesn't work for me, so either Miss Mary doesn't like me, or it's a load of BS. Mary I is one of the most infamous queens in British history. In fact, she was granted the name Bloody Mary because of the amount of Protestants she had burned at the stake. Almost 300. And this was all in the name of Catholicism. But how did she get here? Was Mary just the evil queen out for blood? Or was she just a victim in a series of unfortunate events? Well, you're going to find out on this episode of Caramel. Drizzle TV. Mary I was born on the 18th of February 1516 in Greenwich to King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Mary was actually the only daughter of theirs to survive more than a year. Catherine had given birth to 3 boys and 1 daughter beforehand, but they either died very young or were stillborn. Mary had a very pleasant childhood. She received a lot of attention, being that she was the first princess, and she was loved dearly by her parents. Mary was even groomed to be the next Queen of England. Her mum taught her how to read and speak Latin, which was considered a man's dialect. Despite King Henry's love for his daughter, she wasn't the heir he wanted. If you know anything about Henry VIII, you would understand that he really wanted a son to carry on his name and legacy. After many attempts for a son, Henry began to grow increasingly frustrated with his wife. Some historians also believe that Mary had endometriosis, which is a condition that affects the woman's uterus. Henry may have felt that Mary was just unfit to be a ruler in the first place. Once it became clear that Catherine was not going to give birth to any more children, Henry demanded a divorce. However, since England was under the Catholic Church at the time, this was not allowed. The church wouldn't even make an exception for the king. This resulted in the creation of the Protestant Church of England. After making this establishment, Henry granted himself the divorce, and he went on to marry Anne Boleyn, who gave birth to his second daughter, Elizabeth I. 11-year-old Mary was declared illegitimate, and she was forced to serve as a half-sister's lady-in-waiting. So Mary essentially went from the future Queen of England to a servant in the span of 11 years. This angered Mary very much. She refused to accept Anne as the Queen of England and Elizabeth as the princess. As a result of this, Henry banned her from seeing her mother. Even when Catherine was on her deathbed, Mary was refused permission to see her. Anne would subsequently be executed in 1536, and after only 1 year, Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, gave birth to his long-awaited son, Edward. Henry's second daughter, Elizabeth, would also be declared illegitimate. Her succession rights were stripped, and she would join her older half-sister as a lady-in-waiting. It was during this time that Mary's relationship with her father worsened. Once Henry established the Church of England, he insisted that Mary recognise him as head of church, acknowledge that the marriage between her parents was unlawful, and accept her own illegitimacy. Mary did try to reconcile on her own terms because, like her mother, she was a devout Catholic, and Henry's requests went against her beliefs. However, her efforts were futile, so for her own well-being she ended up agreeing to her father's demands. This resulted in her having a place in court, and she was allowed many of the privileges she once had as a princess. Mary would not have much of a relationship with Henry's next 2 wives. His fourth wife, Catherine Howard, was only 17 when they got married, and she was beheaded 2 years later. And Anne of Cleves did not have much contact with the king at all. Mary did end up growing close to the 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr. In fact, it was because of her that Henry added both Mary and Elizabeth back in the line of succession after his son Edward. This may have been seen as a noble act, but Henry most likely assumed that his son would have many children of his own, which would mean the crown wouldn't touch his sisters at all. And despite this act, they were still legally illegitimate. After Henry's death in 1547, Edward became king, and England continued under Protestant rule. Mary distanced herself from her brother. She rarely attended court affairs, and she still chose to practice her faith. She even ran her own chapel. Throughout his reign, Edward did try to convince Mary to become Protestant, but to no avail. After only 5 years on the throne, the 15-year-old king contracted a lung infection. And with his death imminent, Edward decided to choose his first cousin, once removed, Lady Jane Grey, as his successor. Although this was not legal, Edward feared that if his sister Mary took the throne, she would restore Catholicism to the country. After Edward's passing, Lady Jane Grey became queen for around 9 days. Despite England being a Protestant country, there were still many people of the Catholic faith who were in support of Mary. She assembled a military force and took the throne from Jane. She would consequently be put in the Tower of London. Although Mary was initially accepted by the people, she soon grew out of favour with them, as she started to enforce Catholic laws. The disdain for her only worsened when she decided to marry Philip of Habsburg, heir to the Spanish throne. Spain was a Roman Catholic state, so many felt like the two countries would end up merging together. Mary also used her status as queen to take revenge on those who had wronged her in the past. For example, she had Archbishop Thomas Cranmer burned at the stake. Cranmer had been responsible for annulling her mother's marriage with Henry. Therefore, he was technically the catalyst for Mary's miserable life. This was not the end. The Queen had over 300 people burnt at the stake for heresy. And she didn't discriminate. Even pregnant women weren't exempt from this torture. At one point, Sir Thomas Wyatt and the Duke of Suffolk gathered an army to overthrow the Queen in the now infamous Wyatt Rebellion. They charged into London, but they were swiftly defeated by Mary's supporters, and she had around 100 rebels hanged. All these executions earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. Queen Mary grew so paranoid of a Protestant uprising that she even imprisoned her own sister Elizabeth, which was very shocking since she supported Mary when she took the throne from Lady Jane Grey. In the later years of her life, she tried to get pregnant with her husband Philip, who didn't even love her. He rejected the Queen and spent a lot of time in Spain. He even used her to make England fight in a war with Spain against France. In regards to her pregnancy, at some point she experienced morning sickness, her abdomen expanded, and she reportedly felt the baby move. An official announcement was made that the Queen was expecting, and as the anticipated delivery drew near, Mary retreated from public view for her lying-in period. Sometime afterwards, word spread that Mary had given birth to a son, and her subjects started celebrating. However, the news turned out to be only a rumour. More time passed, but a royal infant never appeared, and eventually it became apparent one never would. Although it's unclear what exactly happened, some medical experts now suggest that the monarch might have had a phantom pregnancy. This is a rare condition in which a woman has many of the symptoms of pregnancy, and in some cases even experiences labour pain, but they are ultimately not carrying a child. Several years after her forced pregnancy, Mary once again incorrectly thought she was expecting. She was going to have to accept that her imprisoned half-sister was going to be queen. Mary grew increasingly ill after the second forced pregnancy. Historians have attributed this to ovarian cysts or uterine cancer, which may have been caused by her undiagnosed endometriosis. She died on the 17th of November 1558 at the age of 42. Although Mary stated in her will that she wanted to be buried with her mother, her request was not honoured, and she was instead laid to rest in Westminster Abbey in a tomb she would share with her half-sister Elizabeth. The inscription reads, "Consorts in realm and tomb, we sisters Elizabeth and Mary lie down to sleep in hope of the resurrection." Her sister Elizabeth would become one of the greatest rulers the world has ever known. So, this was the true story about Bloody Mary. As you can see, she did have a troubled life. Her own father declared her illegitimate. She became a servant, she was denied access to her birth mother, and she suffered from an illness that would not be diagnosed for another 300 years. In regards to her nickname Bloody Mary, this just seems to be Protestant propaganda. It's estimated that she had around 300 people executed, which is a lot, but if we compare this to other rulers such as her father Henry, who allegedly had over 50,000 people executed, there's literally no competition. Anyways, What did you think about Mary Tudor? Do you have any sympathy for her now? Or do you think she was just like her father? Have a great day. Bye now.